4 days after the elections, it was revealed yesterday that the European Court is fining Hungary approximately 80 billion forints for violating European Union immigration policy, and they added a daily payment of about 400 million forints. The court set this at 70 times the fine requested by the Commission. I am also asking Prime Minister Viktor Orban about the decision.
Good morning.
Good morning. How did you interpret this verdict?
So George Soros' court made this judgment. It is well known that the European Union, what we call the Brussels bubble, is full of George Soros' people. Bubble, as we call it, is filled with George Soros' people. This applies to the Parliament, the Commission, and the judiciary too. Soros has a plan. He announced it, never hid it. He wrote it himself, signed it, and published it. They have to bring in 1 million every year. If the Union does not have the money for the migrant, he will lend it. And the traditional identity of the European continent, which is Christian and European, must be changed. That will change. And Europe should become a continent with a mixed population. It does not matter if the white and European population decreases. Something new will come in its place. That is the essence of the Soros plan. Yesterday, the first person to welcome the court's decision was George Soros, his leader in Brussels. That's the situation. It is actually an old conflict. This started in 2015 to 2016, when Hungary faced the difficult decision of how to defend itself against the flood of refugees, predominantly young men, coming in hundreds of thousands from the south, invading young men. To defend against the influx of refugees, we built a fence with police, soldiers, border guards, and border hunters. We did everything we could, spent 2 billion euros to protect Hungary, so that Hungary stays Hungary. We have a debate with Brussels. We believe Brussels does not have the right to tell us who we should live with. The Brussels migration demand means we should let them in. Let's give them money, provide for them, and let them live here with us. But this is not for us to decide. It will be decided in Brussels. We insist that only Hungarians in Hungary should decide who we live with. This is the crux of the debate. Now we have to pay a hefty fine. I'm racking my brain to figure out how to make it hurt them more than us. There are stories and possible solutions. This current Hungarian government is not known for giving up or panicking when faced with a difficult situation at first glance. We do not usually complain. We do not wring our hands. We think things through. I can tell you there will be solutions. The Hungarian people can be sure that in the end, this will hurt Brussels more than Hungary. The money, by the way, is an enormous amount. So if I could distribute 80 billion forints among families, give it to pensioners or spend it on child protection, everyone would be happy. And, for example, an additional 400 billion daily, this is enormous. Something the world has never seen before. So if I say it's shocking or outrageous, considering the history of European court decisions so far, I'm really making a very restrained statement. I mean, it is simply insane.
Yes, and the question is particularly interesting from the perspective of what options the government currently has, because the court has stated that if Hungary does not pay, then over time this money will be withheld from the European Union funds that are supposed to be allocated to Hungary.
Well, there's a lot to sort out. So the solution isn't that we just don't pay and then stare blankly and laugh. Because contrary to the lies spread during the election campaign, the situation is that a significant portion of the money due to Hungary from the European Union we've already brought home. The lies spread during the election campaign. The reality is that a significant portion of the money owed to Hungary from the European Union has already been brought home by us. More specifically, is there in Brussels on the accounts. You just need to send the invoices for the Hungarian developments and investments, like you know what I'm talking about. From the cohesion funds, which are part of the current 7-year budget, Hungary is entitled to 22 billion euros. Out of that, we've already, sorry if you think I'm bragging, but I've managed to secure 12 billion euros through all sorts of bloody hand-to-hand fights, battles back and forth, conditions removed somehow. I managed to bargain 12 billion euros is there in our account. Now they say if we do not pay, they will deduct it from there. Okay, fine, I understand. We will have a big response to that too.
What does it mean that this decision was made public 4 days after the election? We have already talked about it before, that perhaps this decision was already made earlier, but it has only been made public now.
We knew the decision was made look, the Brussels, but these are Brussels people. So they're sneaky, but I don't know what to say. For a Hungarian person, everything that happens there is hard to grasp culturally, because the expectation towards me, the expectation of Hungarian people from politicians, is generally that, one, they speak clearly, speak Hungarian and preferably tell the truth. This is accepted by the Hungarian people, that it cannot always be exact, because there are cases where it is better to avoid the answer and come back to it later, so there really is some leeway. But overall, dishonesty, unclear speech, the use of jargon, these are punishable in Hungarian politics, and voters do punish them, or only the bad guys speak like that. So the one who stands out there is the one who speaks directly and clearly what we want. That's why Hungarians usually stand out there. They look at us as if we are radicals, but we are not doing anything else, just saying what we mean and what is in our interest, or what we think and what is in our interest. We are trying to convey and make it understandable for others. So what I can say is that there's this sneakiness where someone says something but you have no idea what they actually want. From the Hungarian perspective, the whole thing has this kind of slimy, sticky, slug-like vibe. Slimy, mucus-like, snail-like environment. It is not our world. What is there? And hence there was a decision. Everyone knew it existed, but they denied it. They had to wait for the election, as obviously those funded by Brussels in Hungary. Hungarian parties would have received a big slap from the voters, even bigger than now, and they would not have had a chance to allow the election. Even now they didn't, but then they definitely would not have, because even more Hungarian people's eyes would have been open to the fact that the opposition, or the left, is actually in the pay of the Brussels people, which they always deny. But the whole story here repeatedly highlights this. It keeps underlining this again and again. This is the situation. Well, it is what it is. It does not work. We shape the course of the world, and we must protect our values and interests even in an environment that is culturally foreign and hostile.
We'll return to the election results later, but since you mentioned personal interests, there was another important event this week as the NATO Secretary General was here for talks on Wednesday, and according to the party's information, Hungary received guarantees related to the Russian-Ukrainian war on several points. For instance, that it does not have to participate in military actions outside of its territory, and it does not have to provide either money or people for the war. What is the significance? The guarantees given by Jens Stoltenberg are significant from the Peace Party's standpoint.
Well, look, this is a very important and very favorable agreement for us. I don't call it historic, because that term is overused in Hungarian politics. But what was the peace march about? It is very important that the largest expression of collective will in Hungary in recent times was the peace march. The idea was that the location also symbolized that Hungary should remain an island of peace. This means two things. Nothing should threaten our peaceful life, neither from outside nor from within. We manage migration because we see that in Western Europe it disrupts social peace. So there is no peaceful life if there are migrants. This has been clearly shown by the European experiences of the past few years. So when we stand for peace, we also stand against migration, because we want to protect our peaceful, familiar, orderly way of life. Another threat to peace comes from beyond our borders, when a war disrupts peace. From this perspective, the discussions were important. There is a fundamental difference, I would not say conflict, because Hungary, unlike with Brussels, does not have conflicts in NATO. So in Brussels we have many conflicts, even regular disputes with the American Democrats. But within NATO, we are among the accepted, recognized, loyal, cooperative, and exceptionally cooperative countries. 1,300 Hungarian soldiers are currently participating in NATO operations. Our defense spending exceeds 2% of our gross domestic product, which is the NATO rule. Out of the 32 members, if I remember correctly, only 11 of us fulfill this obligation. The internal structure of our defense spending is also as NATO requests. We carry out airspace policing tasks in Slovakia, Slovenia, and occasionally in the Baltic states, and we are also NATO liaisons in some Central Asian and African countries. So I have to say that for our size, we make a significant contribution. Of course, it cannot be compared to the contributions of Turkey or the United States, but relative to our size, certainly. And this is respected, this is acknowledged. So NATO is our home. Now, however, there is a problem here that is, out of the 32 NATO member states, 31 want to defeat the Russians. And they say that this war can only be ended if the Ukrainians defeat the Russians, but the Ukrainians cannot do this on their own, so NATO should help the Ukrainians to defeat the Russians. They also believe that the current war can be ended if the Ukrainians win. So they think the solution is on the battlefield. That is a mistake, even if 31 say it, because we stand alone in our conviction.
We are convinced
this war cannot be
that...
solved on the battlefield. If Tias says, therefore is that in me, USA will say, or instead of supporting one side or the other, we should push for an immediate ceasefire so that no more people die by tomorrow morning and start peace talks to resolve this situation as permanently as possible. We believe this is what should be facilitated.
A nation, not war.
But NATO is promoting the war. We are we are on the side of peace. Now NATO wants to carry out actions to help Ukraine.
That's it.
They have put together the first package. This is how NATO wants to assist them.
So stupid, such an idiot.
A new so-called Ukrainian mission.
NATO.
This means that NATO...
How will Kurdi handle Ukraine?
The transfer of weapons, they will establish 3 large bases where they will hand over the weapons to Ukraine, but that is beside the point. Still here on NATO countries' territory, in Poland, Slovakia, Romania, we're not willing to do this. We think that wherever weapons are being transferred, it becomes a military target from the enemy's perspective, and anything could happen there. And I don't want to risk Hungary or the Hungarian people.
It's somehow Russian.
I am not going to make any part of Hungary a military target. I want to avoid that, and I am working on it. And so far, this has been successful. So the Ukrainian mission from NATO means setting up these weapon coordination transfer points. Secondly, NATO members pool money to support Ukraine's military efforts. And thirdly, they train Ukrainian soldiers. There's a debate about whether they will train them on their own territory or in Ukraine. But the main point is that they are directly involved in the training of Ukrainian soldiers who are going to the front. Hungary does not want to participate in this, and this problem had to be solved. Obviously, there's enormous pressure on us. 31 member states are pushing us to switch from the side of peace to the side of war, or to fight just like they do. If I want to be more accurate, it's about joining those who believe that peace can be achieved through war and winning the war. But we are not willing to do that. We had to resolve this. Our demands were very clear. We will not give a single penny, especially in the shadow of Brussels like this. 2, we will not make Hungarian territory available for the preparation of military actions. 3, we continue to not supply weapons. And if there is an operation outside of NATO territory, we will not participate. Okay. You know, this is a difficult issue because if Hungary is allowed to, then others might also get the idea. The reason it's difficult for NATO to accept such a stance is that they don't want Hungary to set the precedent, and I understand this. But NATO's considerations cannot come before Hungary's national interests and the perspectives of Hungarian peace. This is what needed to be developed and negotiated. It was a difficult negotiation, a long negotiation, and in the end we reached an agreement and got everything we wanted. What we wanted was achieved, though in return, I committed that we will not obstruct at the next NATO summit in Washington those who want to establish such a Ukrainian mission, but we will stay out of it.
At the same time, this is interesting because no guarantee from a NATO secretary has changed our geographical situation. We are still neighbors of a country at war. If we look at it from this perspective, how dangerous are the plans of either NATO or European Union politicians or countries to Hungary's security?
The countries in the region, like the Poles and Romanians, are reacting in 2 ways. They're moving forward because they believe that since they're closest to the front line, they can offer the most help to the Ukrainians, and they're getting involved in the war. The Slovaks are cautious, and the Hungarians are clear. We say that precisely because we are close. We need to be 3 times as cautious as someone dangling their feet on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean in France, or having a beer in the Bavarian forest.
tosta okeik posai. It's not the same as living near Nairagihaza. So we come to a different conclusion. Upau opusat, we believe physical proximity increases the danger, so we need to be cautious. But the most important argument was this:
There were a lot.
Because as the Secretary General, like everyone else says, governments exist to make the decisions that need to be made. Don't dawdle. Don't pass the buck. They are the government.
Thank you for
watching. They are the
watching.
leaders. They need to make decisions. And when it comes to matters of war and peace, sometimes difficult decisions have to be made. This is generally true. But 3 days after the elections, the situation changes. 3 days after the election, where the whole country voted on war or peace, the Hungarian government received the strongest reinforcement and said that I am not representing the government's stance. We have a very clear mandate from the people. We just received it. We won the European and municipal elections by a wide margin on the question of whether Hungarian political parties should stand on the side of war or peace. And those who stood on the side of peace won. There's no room for maneuver here. This was the decisive argument, and they understood it. In Washington and Brussels, they quickly realized that they could try, but the Hungarian government would not budge from its position because it received reinforcement and commitment from its own voters. I traveled the country for 2 months with this message. I went everywhere I could to ask people to understand that this is a question of war and peace, and to vote with that in mind. Their vote wouldn't just generally have consequences, but specifically just 3 days after the election, using this election result, I was able to keep Hungary out of the NATO-Ukraine mission.
Since you mentioned Germany and France, it's worth taking a look at the election results there as well. In Germany, the ruling coalition's 3 parties gained a total of 31%, while in France, Macron's party secured barely 15% of the votes. Could this, and if so, to what extent, could this change the stance or attitude of Western countries towards the war? Because from their perspective, from the perspective of the ruling parties,
when I met people
results.
during the election campaign, I didn't just talk to them about Hungary's position, Hungarian interests, or historical experiences, but I was also able to discuss the European situation with them. One thing is that Hungary wants to stay out of it, pull the emergency brake on the train heading towards war, and get off. That's the minimum goal. Daniel, we could be more ambitious. Let's try to stop the train. Not only should we get off, but let's allow others to disembark as well. And I said there is a chance for this if the European right, which is peace-oriented, wins. Because then the whole of Europe could stay out of the war, which is important because if European leaders are less pro-war, it would be easier for Hungary to avoid involvement. I'm not saying this just out of self-interest, thinking about our own situation, though it would benefit Hungary if Europeans move towards peace. But it's also about the interest of all of Europe. What we represent is right in the European context and also from a moral standpoint. Everyone was asking, okay, but how is this going to happen? My answer is like this. So what happens is if, because it says there are democracies in Europe with all sorts of issues, but still, they are democracies. You cannot ignore the people's opinion. And if governments see that the consequence of a pro-war stance is their downfall, then they get some extra motivation to start thinking about peace. And now it's clear, and I told the Secretary General this too. I understand their calculations on how they intend to win against the Russians in Ukraine, but there is one factor worth considering. The European people do not want this. They do not want this war. And the more they force European governments to be pro-war, the more they destabilize the political situation in these European countries. On election day, 2 governments fell, the French and the Belgian. The German Chancellor's party came in 3rd place in its own country's election. Unprecedented in Germany. I assert that the will of the European people is a clear signal to European leaders saying, my friend, if you do not stand on the side of peace, you will fall. Now, it might not be as clear and loud as I interpret it here, but I am convinced that this process has begun, and therefore, with the European election, despite the European Parliament having little to do with the war, with the European election, as it happened everywhere on a national basis. Just like in Hungary, we have already slowed down the train rushing towards war, buying Europe some time. They are not going further than what the Secretary General has now called the NATO-Ukraine mission. The situation could be much worse. The American presidential election is coming in November, and if Mr. Trump returns, who was the president of peace and hopefully will be again, we will not only have gained time, but then we will have the peace-oriented transatlantic cooperation. So here we have a situation in Europe, and there a situation in America.
How has it
Peace
changed
can
from
be
this
achieved.
perspective?
Well, we'll take a little detour about the stakes of the American elections, because just yesterday he met with Donald Trump Jr. Well, being American is not easy, and putting ourselves in their shoes isn't either. Let's not forget, we're talking about a country that was created or as a result of its founding is protected by oceans on two sides. To the north, there's a culturally similar country, Canada. To the south, we see, due to migration, there are also Christian countries. They cause problems like migration, but pose no military threat to the security of the United States. There is no safer place in the world than the United States. Perhaps that's why it was established there. So that's why Americans have no sense of danger, or if they do, it only arises in the context of nuclear war, because they are almost untouchable. Unlike Hungary, where it's just a border away, and from Vásárosnámeni, you can see across to the other side, which at the moment is Ukraine.
I'm sorry.
Situation assessment. They think there is none. I mean, that's how the Trumpists think.
Work with nowhere to go.
What is the realistic scenario on the table that convincingly proves
Dana,
the
are you
aid
coming?
being given to Ukraine will lead to victory? Hence, it's thrown away money, wasted lives, unnecessarily squandered energy. It's not rational. That's their argument. This is different from our reasoning, but the conclusion is the same. One last question. Let's go back to the European parliamentary elections. You mentioned that the European right has gained strength. However, in order to have a greater ability to assert influence, should the fragmented factions somehow be united? What are the chances of forming a large right-wing party family, in your view? And what could be Fidesz's role in this? My hopes are moderated. The two women need to come to an agreement, including the French presidential candidate, Marine Le Pen.
The French version won by a mile.
In Hungary, sometimes we win by a landslide, like recently, where there was a 15% difference between first and second place, but this is not common in Western Europe. So, that's what happened. A huge gap opened up between the president's party and Le Pen's party. They formed the largest faction in the European Parliament, the right-wing one in Italy, which is also led by a woman. If the two of them can come to an agreement, anti-ISIS, and if we Fidesz also join them, we could create the second largest faction in the European Parliament. In fact, I think we could even bring over parties from the People's Party. It could easily happen that within half a year, the right wing would have the largest parliamentary faction in Europe. We usually dream about this. Then we wake up and find out that the two ladies can't agree. So at this moment, things stand as negotiations are underway, but they are very slowly moving toward each other. We are trying to facilitate this process. Our possibilities are limited due to the size of our country. It's true that out of 21 mandates, we've secured 11. It is unprecedented in Europe for someone to secure more than half of the mandates. This gives us great prestige, but not enough influence, because the weight lies in the number of mandates. We have 11. The Italian president has 21, maybe 24, and the French president has perhaps 29, 30. 31. So they are the ones who will decide this. But if we add our 11 to their cooperation, then we have the right-wing shift in Europe. This is what we are waiting for. This is what we are working towards.
I asked Prime Minister Viktor Orban about the European Court's decision yesterday, the Russia-Ukraine war, and the conclusions that can be drawn from the European Parliament election results in the past half hour.